just want to start off by saying if you want an answer at the end, prepare to be disappointed. Because there just isn't one. I was an intern at Nickelodeon Studios for a year in 2005 for my degree in animation. It wasn't paid, of course. Most internships aren't, but I did have some perks beyond education. To adults, it might not seem like a big one, but most kids at the time would go crazy over it. Now, since I worked directly with the editors and animators, I got to view the new episodes days or even weeks before they aired. I'll get right to it without giving too many unnecessary details. They had very recently made the SpongeBob movie, and the entire staff was somewhat sapped of creativity, so it took them longer to start up a new season. But the delay lasted for more upsetting reasons. There was a problem with the Series 4 premiere that set everyone and everything back for several months. Me and two other interns were in the editing room along with the lead animators and sound editors for the final cut. We received a copy that was supposed to be Fear of a Krabby Patty, gathered around the screen to watch. Now, given that it isn't yet final, animators often put up a little mock title card, and sort of an inside joke for us, with phony, oftentimes lewd titles, such as How House Sex Doesn't Work instead of Rockabye Bivalve, when SpongeBob and Patrick adopt a sea scallop. Nothing particularly funny, but a few work-related chuckles, I guess. So when we saw the title card Squidward Suicide, we didn't get more than a morbid joke. One of them did a small throat laugh at it, and the happy-go-lucky music plays as normal. The story began with Squidward practicing his clarinet, hitting a few sour notes how he always does. When we hear SpongeBob laughing outside and Squidward stops, yelling at him to keep it down as he has a concert that night and needs to practice, SpongeBob says okay and goes to see Sandy with Patrick. The bubbles splash screen come up, and we see the ending of Squidward's concert. This is when things began to unravel and seem off. While playing, a few frames repeat themselves, but the sound doesn't. Now, at this point, the sound is synced up with the animation, so yes, that's not common. But when he stops playing, the sound finishes as if the skip never happened. There's a slight murmuring in the crowd before they begin to boo him. Not that normal cartoon booing that you see all the time in SpongeBob, but you could very clearly hear malice in it. Squidward's in full frame looks very visibly afraid and scared of the crowd. And as the shot pans toward them, we see SpongeBob in center frame, and he too is booing, very much unlike him. Now, that isn't the oddest thing, however. What's really odd is that everyone had these hyper-realistic eyes, very detailed. Clearly not shots of real people's eyes, but something a bit more real than CGI. The pupils were red, and some of us in the studio looked at each other, obviously confused, but since we weren't the writers, we didn't question its appeal to children just yet. The shot then moves to Squidward sitting on the edge of his bed, looking very forlorn. The view out his porthole window is of a night sky, so it isn't very long after the concert. The unsettling part at this point is there is literally no sound. I mean, no sound at all. Nothing. Not even feedback from the speakers. It's as if the speakers were turned off. Though their status showed them working at 100% perfection. And he just sat there, blinking in the silence for about 30 seconds. And then he started to sob softly. He put his hands, tentacles, over his eyes and cried quietly for more than a full minute. All the while, a sound in the background very slowly growing from nothing to barely audible. It sounded like a slight breeze moving through a forest. The screen slowly begins to zoom in on his face. And by slow, I mean it's only noticeable if you look at shots 10 seconds apart, side by side. His sobbing gets louder, more full of hurt and anger. The screen then twitches a bit, as if it twists in on itself, and for a split second, it turned back to normal. The wind going through the trees sound gets slowly louder and more severe, as if a storm is brewing far from there. Now the eerie part is the sound, and Squidward's sobbing sounded real. As if the sound wasn't coming from the speakers, but it sounded more like the speakers were holes connected to another room, and the sound was coming from the other side. As good as sound as studios likes to have, but they don't purchase the equipment to be that good to produce sound of such high quality. Below the sound of wind and sobbing, it was intensely faint, but it sounded like someone laughing. It came at odd intervals and never lasted more than a second, so you had a hard time pinning it down. We watched the show twice, so pardon me if things sound too specific, but I've had time to think about it. After 30 seconds of this going on, the screen blurs and twitched violently, and something flashed over the screen as if a single frame was replaced. The lead animation editor paused and rewound frame by frame. And what we saw was horrible. It was a still photo of a dead child. He couldn't have been more than 6. His face was mangled and bloodied, and one eye dangling over his upturned face popped. He was naked down to his underwear, and his stomach crudely cut open, and his entrails lay beside him. He was lying on some sort of pavement that was probably a road. The most upsetting part was that there was a shadow of the photographer. There was no crime tape, no evidence of tags or markers, and the angle was completely off for a shot designed to be evidence. It would seem that the photographer was the person responsible for killing this child. We were, of course, mortified, but pressed on, hoping that it was just a sick joke. And at that moment, the screen flipped back to Squidward, still sobbing, louder than before, half body and frame. There was now what appeared to be blood running down his face from his eyes. The blood was also done in a hyper-realistic style, looking as if you went to touch the screen, you'd get blood on your fingers. And the wind now sounded as if it were that of a gale blowing through the forest. There were even sounds of snapping branches. The laughing, a deep baritone, lasting at longer intervals and coming more frequently. After about 20 seconds, the screen again twisted and showed a single frame photo. Now the editor was extremely reluctant to go back. We all were. But we know what we had to do. This time the photo was what appeared to be a little girl, no older than the first child. She was lying on her stomach, her barrettes in a pool of blood next to her. Her left eye was also out and popped. She was naked except for her underpants, and her entrails were piled on top of her above another crude cut along her back. Again, the body was on the street, and the photographer's shadow was visible, very similar in size and shape to the first, and I had to choke back vomit, and one intern, the only female in the room, ran out, crying and nearly vomiting. We waited a couple seconds, and the show resumed. Now, about 5 seconds after this second photo played, Squidward went silent, as did all sound, like it was when the scene began. He put his tentacles down, and his eyes were now done in hyper-realism like the others were in the beginning of this episode. They were bleeding, bloodshot, and pulsating. He just stared at the screen, as if he was watching the viewer, looking into their every move and soul. And after about 10 seconds, he started sobbing, this time not covering his eyes. The sound was piercing and loud, and the most fear-inducing of all was that his sobbing was mixed with screams. Tears and blood were dripping down his face at a heavy rate. When the wind sound came back, so did the deep-voiced laughing. This time, the photo lasted for a good 5 frames. The animator was able to stop it on the 4th and backed up. And this time the photo was of a boy. About the same age, but this time around, the scene was different. The entrails were just being pulled out from a stomach wound up by a large hand, and the right eye was popped and dangling, blood trickling down it. The animator proceeded. It was hard to believe, but the next one was different, but we couldn't tell what. He went on to the next, same thing. He went back to the first and played them quicker, and I lost it. I vomited all over the floor, and the animating and sound editors were gasping at the screen. The 5 frames were not as if they were 5 different photos. They were played out as if they were frames from a video. We saw the hand slowly lift out the guts, and we saw the kid's eyes focus on it. We even saw 2 frames of the child beginning to blink. The lead sound editor told us to stop. He had to call in the creator to see this. Mr. Hillenberg arrived within 15 minutes. He was confused as to why he was called down there, so the editor just continued the episode. Once the few frames were shown, all screaming, all sound again stopped. Squidward was just staring at the viewer. Full frame of the face for about 3 seconds. The shot quickly panned out, and that deep baritone voice said, "Do it!" And we all see in Squidward's hands a shotgun. He immediately puts the gun in his mouth and pulls back the trigger. Realistic blood and brain matter splatter the wall behind him and his bed. He flies back with the force and the kick of the gun. The last 5 seconds of this episode show his body on the bed. On his side, one eye dangling on what's left of his head, above the floor, staring blankly at it. And then the episode ends. Now, Mr. Hillenberg is obviously furious with this. He demanded to know what the hell was going on. Most people had left the room at this point, so it was just a handful of us to watch it again. Viewing the episode twice only served to imprint the entirety of it in my mind and cause me horrible, horrible nightmares. I'm so sorry I stayed. The only theory we could think of was that the file was edited by someone in the chain from the drawing studio to here. Now, the CTO was called in to analyze when it happened. The analysis of the file did show that it was edited over by new material. However, the timestamp of it was a mere 24 seconds before we began viewing it. All equipment involved was examined for foreign software and hardware as well as glitches. As if the timestamp may have glitched and showed the wrong time, but everything checked out fine. We don't know what happened, and to this day I don't think anyone does. There was an investigation due to the nature of the photos, but nothing came of it. No child scene was identified, no clues were gathered from the data. Not physical clues or none in the photos. I never believed in unexplainable phenomena before, but now that I've had something happen and I can't prove anything about it beyond obvious and just anecdotal evidence, I think twice about things.